Welcome back to the second episode of the Adventure Scholar podcast. My name is Savannah Rivka, and I'm very happy to have you with us on this journey today. And our subject matter for this episode is generational trauma, ways of healing backwards and moving forward. So this is a bit of a content warning in the sense that this is going to be an intense subject. But we are not going to be graphic in any of our descriptions. We're more looking at the effects that trauma has on individuals and communities, and we're going to explore some of the ways that have been suggested to heal through all of this. Now, generational trauma is a very broad subject, and there's other ways of referring to it, transgenerational trauma, and there's other factors that come into play, such as cultural trauma, historical trauma, secondary trauma, which is similar to generational trauma. It's not experienced firsthand. And this is all stored in the collective memory of greater society. So it affects all of us, whether we know that it's there or not. And generational trauma has an impact on the individual level. It can affect family systems, community groups, and whatever groups may have been targeted, sometimes ethnic groups, religious groups, nations, and entire geographic regions. And I would say certainly there are global levels of this. Right now, that's what we're facing with the pandemic. This is going to cause some form of generational trauma, I'm sure. Now, the transgenerational effects that trauma has are not only psychological, but familial, social, cultural, neurobiological, and possibly even genetic as well. And we're going to talk about what I found in regards to that through research. Now, whether we want to face it or not, the impacts of generational trauma are going to be felt, as I said, either on the individual level or in greater society as a whole. And this plays a role in much of the conflicts that we might see playing out throughout history and even in society today. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Now, massive traumas such as war, slavery, these are huge things. They affect people and society in very complex and multi-dimensional ways. So, of course, today we're only going to be able to scratch the surface, but we do feel this is a very important subject, so we wanted to take some time to explore it a bit. Now, I want to start my discussion looking at this from a psychological perspective. So I found a really good book on this titled Transgenerational Trauma and the Other, Dialogues Across History and Difference. This book is a collection of different case studies, and it presented a lot of really interesting perspectives. Now, the way that they framed this, they said, often our transgenerational legacies become fixed stories of us and them that we struggle to resolve. We carry fixed narratives and the ghosts of our perpetrators and of our victims. We long to be subjects in our own history. That is to say, we want to engage with our historical narratives, but we might avoid engaging directly by repeatedly casting the other as a fixed object in their own history. So of course, it's difficult to face these things. It's uncomfortable. So this kind of avoidance could sometimes be unconscious. However, healing transgenerational trauma requires us to engage with the other who carries that corresponding prehistory. Without this dialogue, these alienated ghosts that we carry within us can lead to situations in which people may become stuck or fixated on a state of either the perpetrator or the victim. And then this can manifest in the psyche in ways that impact how the individual would behave in society, and then this can play out politically and in culture. So I think that that's a really good way of framing that, and it actually kind of made me think of the concept of restorative justice, this kind of approach that when something happens, when there's a crime or someone feels wronged or hurt, that we should, of course, we need to take care of the victim, but we shouldn't be totally victim focused. We need to look at everybody who's involved, and we need to bridge those gaps, because if we don't, then we won't be able to really heal the community. Now, some of the earlier cases of generational trauma where it was starting to be recognized came out of the Civil War in the United States. So they started noticing that survivors that came out of the prisoner of war camps, now these were Union soldiers that had been captured, and they were put in these Confederate prisoner of war camps. And these war camps were, prisoner camps, were really awful, horrendous places. And the conditions were so harsh, many people died, very few survived. Those who did survive, though, they returned to society with a lot of problems. So they had impaired health, and then this affected their ability to have jobs. They had very poor job prospects, and they had a shorter life expectancy. Now, what the researchers found is that their sons and grandsons, because for some reason this tends to be passed down more in men, and they're not really sure why, but their sons and grandsons, these are people who never experienced these war camps. They were never prisoners. They were cared for and nurtured for in good ways, but they still had some of the same problems that their fathers and grandfathers had. And they even had higher rates of mortality at 11% higher than the rest of the population. So what they realized is that these prisoners of war ended up passing down some element of their trauma to their offspring. And researchers started to realize that the trauma caused some kind of change in the way that the DNA is expressed and then passed on to the next generation. This is a process known as epigenetics. So this is the nature aspect. So we're going to look at kind of nature and nurture, but this is the nature aspect. So the effects of trauma can actually echo down several generations. And what we find is emotional damage that was experienced even in early childhood could also be passed down to children and grandchildren. Now, psychology has long grappled with the transgenerational transmission of trauma through familial unconscious. So now this is the nurture aspect of the subject. Now, this happens through the way that stories are passed down or discussed in families, relational patterning, and what we're looking at as the ghosts of our ancestors, again, how can we reclaim our elders as well as the roots and branches of our family tree? Because what we need to do is address the healing of individual wounds that were left by large-scale historical movements in some cases, and that's quite an undertaking. Now, one approach that is recommended is to resolve certain enactments that can arise out of the collision of transmitted persecutor and victim identifiers. So what this is meaning is if in your legacy, in your family line, you have that victim or persecutor kind of history, there can be an over-identification that takes place either with the victim or the aggressor. There was a really good case study that came out of this, the book that I mentioned earlier, about a therapy session that or a therapy relationship that went on for many years, where the therapist was the child of a Holocaust survivor. And then the person that therapist served, the client, was the son of a Nazi soldier. So this is a really interesting situation. Now, I should say that because of the professional nature of the relationship, the therapist was not able to tell the client about his background, that he was the child of a Holocaust survivor. But of course, the therapist knew everything about how this person was struggling with the relationship they had with their father. They were so upset that their father had supported the Nazi regime. And it took many years of work, and they had a very good working relationship in these therapy sessions. And eventually, the client had come to acknowledge and accept that some of his more valued qualities, some positive aspects in himself, had actually derived from his father. So he was starting to see other aspects of his father, that his father wasn't just a villain. There were other things about him. And he had engaged in a fruitful integration of his image of his father. And of course, this was many years and a lot of work. Now, the client eventually did find out that the therapist did come from a background where his mother was the survivor of the Holocaust. And he had a remarkably positive response. And he said the fact that two people coming from these two backgrounds with this terrible history can meet and they can make something good happen is incredible. And he went further to say that he wonders if it would have gone as deep and he wonders if it would have been as successful with someone who did not have that history. So what the client was saying, that he actually felt the fact that they were coming from those two different sides was a good thing, and it really helped to bring him to a place of healing and balance. So we need to search for this opportunity for dialogue and healing to occur on both sides, because honestly, everyone is in need of healing. Certainly not just the victims. In regards to political unrest, religious conflict, and wars, they did say that further research is needed to understand the demographic, socio-political, and cultural influences on the transmission of trauma. But ultimately, we should aspire to promote recovery and repair personally, interpersonally, and in geopolitical contexts. Descendants of people who have been exposed to massive trauma and atrocities and descendants of the perpetrators of violence may meet. Of course, this is going to happen in various combinations in the world and throughout life. The outcome of these interactions can certainly be unconsciously impacted by transgenerational factors. So that's why it's really essential that we face these kinds of issues and deal with them directly. Now, I do want to talk about these issues in the context of race and systematic racism. And this is where I think that these issues are playing out in the kinds of conflicts that we're seeing in society today and with Black Lives Matter movements, which I think is really important and to examine and explore. So, of course, race and systemic racism is a historical movement. This is continued oppression which impacts individuals psychologically. And this is based on research. This is not a matter of opinion. And this causes feelings of powerlessness, exhaustion, anxiety, and anger. This is all totally understandable response in the face of racial inequalities and injustices. So what we find is racial trauma, which is the experience of racism, both direct and indirect, in the form of microaggressions or even through the media, can have devastating impacts on mental health for people of color. And what researchers have found is that it causes symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress syndrome or PTSD. So the impacts of racial trauma are very real and very profound. Systemic racism is a term that was developed by sociologist Joe Fegan in his book on racism in America. This is titled Racist America, Roots, Current Realities, and Future Reparations. So in his book, he affirms that racism is embedded in all social institutions, structures, and social relations composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideas, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people, whilst denying those same resources to Black people and people of color. Now, another element that comes into this is ancestral trauma that comes from slavery and segregation under Jim Crow laws. And I found some research out of the UK that says the figures out there, Black people are 8 times more likely than white people to be stopped and searched by police, while here in the United States, police kill Black people at a rate 6 times higher than that of white people, which of course we are seeing every day almost in our media. Now, we're coming back to the DNA element. There's another aspect that researchers are finding that Black infants have higher levels of cortisol reactivity than white infants by the time they are 12 months old. So cortisol is the body's main stress hormone, and it works with parts of the brain to control mood, motivation, and fear. The researchers behind this study, they're based in Cambridge University, and they concluded that experiences of discrimination contributed to cortisol differences within Black infants, suggesting that racial discrimination is already under the skin by 1 year of age. Now, really let that sink in. I mean, that is substantial. Some studies have suggested that racial trauma can also be passed from one generation to the next. In other ways, the process of epigenetics, again, that's how the DNA is changed. So it's how the experiences during a person's life are thought to alter the readability of their genes in the addition of chemical switches in the DNA molecule. So there's evidence that suggests that switches added after traumatic events can be passed down to future generations and manifest in the form of higher mortality rates. Author and researcher Joy DeGruy uses the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, or PTSS, to describe the enduring injury that Black people in America and elsewhere have experienced. While PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, results in a single direct or indirect trauma, or like one incident, PTSS, or the post-traumatic slave syndrome, asserts that Black people globally have suffered collective grief and trauma over many years and many generations, which helps to explain the consequences of multi-generational oppression from centuries of slavery and institutionalized racism, and to identify the resulting adaptive survival behaviors. So that is one thing about trauma that's passed down. It has a good intention to it. It's meant to help us learn how to survive, even if some of the ways that happens can be a bit dysfunctional, right? So addressing these present-day traumas, like racism, that relate to the original trauma is key to helping new generations heal and move on. This is something that many researchers are asserting right now. And parents can really help in this process by using the right communication tools and having, these important conversations throughout in their family, throughout the children's upbringing. Now, I want to look at some other studies on generational trauma. Some early studies on generational trauma were conducted in 1966, and they were examining the families of people who had been exposed to traumatic conditions during the Holocaust. So these were Holocaust survivors and their children and grandchildren. And what they started to find was the same subtle biological and health changes that were getting passed down for a number of generations. So what we find is these implications are very profound. If our experiences can have consequences that reverberate to our children and our children's children, this makes a very powerful argument against, policies that we have today that we know are causing trauma now. For example, in the United States, the immigration policies separating families, very young children from their parents. This will not only cause trauma for the child, but for many generations to come. So it's also possible that trauma can be transmitted through parenting rather than epigenetics. So we're coming back to this idea of nurture. The psychological impact of growing up with a parent who has experienced significant trauma can really have a monumental impact on a child's development. The experience of a parent does influence the way they might end up interacting with their children, especially if they have been, disconnected or unconscious about that trauma and haven't sought support or ways of healing it. However, what we're finding is that research has shown that improvements are possible. They have the potential to eventually help correct some of the alterations that were induced by trauma. So that does give us some hope, right? What they're saying is, what they've found is that even in these instances where someone has experienced trauma and then it affects the epigenetics, if that trauma is dealt with and there is a process of healing initiated that starts working down through with the children and the grandchildren, and then they follow those families, what they're finding is that the DNA and the epigenetics are looking like they're correcting, and that there's ways to heal through the nature and nurture aspect of this. So one thing that I take away from all of this research and this information is just the remarkable power of the human mind and body. Although the initial trauma response may seem dysfunctional in a way, we have to remember that that is an adaptive behavior that has been learned in some way as a result of what had to happen for survival, what we needed to do. And so that's learned on the individual level, and then that is also passed on again for the sake of survival. So the epigenetics are evolving to help our children and our children's children to survive the traumas that we experienced. And then we realize, okay, that this is actually not a good thing, that we're passing on our trauma to our children. And then we start to engage with conscious healing. And if that's worked with over many number of years, we have the potential to maybe correct and heal these issues in the epigenetics and the DNA. So that is really amazing, and there's a lot of potential there. And again, there should be more research on these subjects, especially of the potential of how we can heal and correct it. But I think it's really exciting to see the potential and the possibilities that exist here. Another approach that they found that has been really helpful in the healing process is developing a strong sense of identity or ethnic identity, which can involve educating oneself on the history in a way that does not solely focus on negative aspects, but also embraces positive elements. So an example of this would be African history that doesn't begin with slavery, because of course there's a really rich and beautiful history and culture there. In my own legacy, I can say Jewish history that does not begin with the Holocaust, nor is it defined by that. There's a lot more to Jewish heritage and culture than the atrocities of the Holocaust. Another really good example of this is indigenous culture and history that is not defined by colonization. Now, of course, all of these aspects, the negative aspects, are important. They need to be integrated, they need to be dealt with, but they should not be defining. So the point here is to seek out and really celebrate the positive aspects of the history and make it a part of your identity. so that the negative is not overshadowing those positive aspects. So this is really helpful for healing. So I want to bring in another concept here that I came across in my own research when I was working on my master's degree, and I ended up writing about this in my thesis. Now, this is an academic theory, so I'll try my best to break it down, but this is a theory that is known as critical emancipatory historiography. And this is a concept that was introduced by Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza. And she is a feminist scholar who does her research actually on the Bible and Christian history. So this approach that she presented was addressing accounts by historians who did not adequately regard the roles of underrepresented people. So Schussler-Fiorenza asserted that in some instances, these groups were left out of historical documentation or any analysis altogether. In dealing with such inadequacies in documentation, Schussler-Fiorenza urges the investigation of alternative clues in order to engage with a reconstructive process that she describes in a really beautiful way. She makes the analogy of quilt making. So she explained, the quilt maker carefully stitches material fragments and pieces into an overall design that gives meaning to the individual scraps of material. So I'm kind of using this concept also in connection with this idea of searching for those positive aspects, because for some of us, that can be difficult if our history has not been well documented or it's been disrupted in some kind of way. So what this means is we need to be probing for unacknowledged and forgotten contributions, and there are ways to find this, to find historically relevant information, and then that information can be used to contribute to a larger, all-encompassing picture of society as a whole. So by focusing on the surrounding evidence and seeking out these missing sections, we may reconstruct a more complete and more inclusive image of history and society altogether. So to adapt this approach that Schussler-Fiorenza is recommending, this critical emancipatory historiography, this means to embrace a perspective that views society as radically diverse and heterogeneous, and history as being very complex, multi-layered, rather than monolithic or linear. So what we're saying here is that there are a lot of issues in the way that history has been documented, and so we need to continuously be re-evaluating that in our own processes, both individually for certain communities and just for ourselves, for society as a whole, our understanding collectively. We're coming back to this idea of collective memory because we have missing pieces. So again, Schussler-Fiorenza emphasized the importance of the recovery of both the history and the heritage for oppressed and underrepresented individuals. Now, Schussler-Fiorenza also referenced work by a Caribbean writer, Michelle Cliff. And what she did was she traced the history of oppression with an awareness that the whole may not be recovered as it once was. Of course, we can't get the original because it was lost, and that's part of the mourning process. That acknowledgement of that loss can be part of the healing process as well. But what is possible is recovering a past of ourselves which we can reclaim as our own. So the emphasis here again is on seeking out those fragments, those little gems which are missing from history, and they may require to be reassembled, and this is coming from, in many cases, a perspective of identity-based work. So Cliff continued by explaining that this may require the blending of that which was taught by the oppressor and undermining the language and styles which were imposed by turning them to serve the purpose of the oppressed. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are many people who, within their own heritage, when we're talking about generational trauma, some of us have the ghost of the oppressor and the oppressed, or the victim and the perpetrator, all within our own family tree. And so then we get this kind of blending and reclamation. And this is really complex, really challenging work, but I think that it's something that can be, if it's worked through in a good way, can be empowering. Now, again, this is coming back to this critical emancipatory historiography, explains the overall objective here is to expose that history which has been suppressed or excluded in traditional approaches to historical studies. So she concludes that ultimately, historical knowledge is constituted of choices and inevitable exclusions, which are going to require further investigation, and honestly, continuous investigation, in order to construct a complete and more inclusive image of the past. And of course, doing this is going to serve us in the present. It's going to help us heal. And it's going to help prevent further harm for future generations. So this theoretical vantage point was explained by Schussler-Fiorenza in a way. It illuminates the greater clarity of what responsibilities, interests, political functions, and communicative practices are necessary within feminist critical historiography. Now, I hope that wasn't too theoretical. I tend to kind of enjoy getting into some of that stuff, but I know it can be a bit of a headache. It can be quite complicated. But I wanted to bring that in because I think that that can also be helpful, and I want to have that awareness that when we're talking about generational trauma, there's a certain loss there. You know, with slavery, colonization, when we're talking about wars, there are holes in the history, and that is part of the trauma. So I wanted to kind of bring this concept in connection with this idea of seeking out positive elements. We also have reconstructive work. But this work is absolutely possible. It's not going to be easy, of course, and it's a continuous process. And honestly, it works best when we have, as has been discussed in this piece, everyone working together. So the people who have the ghosts of, we have to face all of our ghosts, the ghosts of the victims, the ghosts of the perpetrators that we're all carrying within us. And so I think that we do have a lot of potential in facing these subjects moving forward.
Cultural trauma has taken its toll on the indigenous people of the Americas. The methods and effects of this can be explored through the legend of La Llorona. La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, is a prominent folk legend among Chicano communities. She is described as a specter who cries and wails in the night, lamenting the loss of her children. She wears a flittering white dress and emits a strange translucent glow. She appears near lakes, rivers, and sometimes roads as she searches for wayward children to replace her own. Her children, who, according to some versions of the legend, she drowned in a river. Parents use stories of La Llorona, like the boogeyman, to frighten children into behaving, and to avoid very real dangers of fast-moving bodies of water and roads. Virtually every Chicano or Mexicano has a first or second-hand encounter story relating to La Llorona. Whether or not one believes in phantasms does not change the fact that this community is haunted by something. Many scholars believe that La Llorona, as a legend, represents a symbol for cultural trauma. There are many elements of the story that can be identified as analogous to the conquest, as exemplified in one of the more distinctly Mexican versions of the story. While traveling, a wealthy nobleman became infatuated by a beautiful peasant woman named Maria. He was so enamored with Maria that he had to have her. He proposed, she accepted. They were married, and Maria soon bore two beautiful children. The nobleman continued his travels, returning periodically, each time growing less and less affectionate towards Maria. Eventually, it was clear to Maria that her husband had fallen out of love with her, and his attention was drawn by a younger woman. In her rage, she took their children to the river and drowned them to punish him. Upon realizing what she had done, she became overwhelmed with anguish and drowned herself. As a result of her sins of infanticide and suicide, she is now denied entry into heaven and doomed to wander the earth. Some storytellers add that a demon tricked Maria into believing that the souls of her children were lost on earth. This demon convinced Maria that she would be allowed into heaven if she was able to retrieve their souls. Knowing full well that the children, being innocent, were already in heaven, this demon used Maria to harvest the souls of living children for himself. This virtual fairy tale carries a great deal of cultural baggage to unpack. It paints the Spanish conquistador as a noble prince who honorably makes the native woman his wife. Her inability to accept his prowess leads her to become a monster and is punished by divine forces for her lack of subservience. This interpretation calls to mind the story of Lilith, who, according to Hebrew tradition, was Adam's first wife in the Garden of Eden. She was cast out because she refused to lie with Adam, and in the wilderness consorted with demons, and became the mother of monsters. Viewing the origin story of La Llorona through a different lens, one can see the bias towards the colonial powers of Spain and Catholicism. The reality of assimilation is a very real and sinister thing. The indigenous people experience an apocalypse through systematic attempted genocide. In order to survive under colonization, they intermarried and absorbed aspects of the invading culture, more often than not, unwillingly. From a more indigenous perspective, La Llorona is crying for the people. There are stories of her that predate Maria and her nobleman. According to the writings of Diego Duran, a Spanish monk known for documenting Aztec history, and the Florentine Codex, a collection of Mesoamerican ethnography from the 16th century, a weeping woman appeared at night in the streets of Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, and formerly the capital of the Aztec Empire. It was said that this woman, referred to as Ciacoat by the Aztecs, walked about crying loudly, "My beloved sons, we are about to go. What will become of my children?" This manifestation was recognized as one of the many omens warning of the Spanish impending arrival and the subsequent annihilation of the Aztecs. Ciacoat was an Aztec maternal deity. She co-created humanity with her consort Quetzalcoatl, and arguably represents an archetypal collective mother to the descendants of the Aztec people. Similarly, Maria is a Catholicized archetypal collective mother, and to the contemporary Chicano and Mexicano people, who is likewise vilified as an indigenous archetype. A historical inspiration for La Llorona can be found in the life of Malinali. An examination of the documentation of her story illustrates the more sinister nature of conquest and slavery. Also known as La Malencine, Malinali came from a prominent family. Her people lived in a province that bordered the Aztec Empire to the south. Her people spoke Nahuatl, same as the Aztecs, and due to their proximity to Mayan territory, she, as equivalent to a noble, was very well versed in the Mayan language. Upon the death of her father, and in order to prevent her from interfering with the rule of her half-brother, she was given away to a community near what is now Veracruz. Upon his arrival in Veracruz, Hernan Cortés was given Malinali as a gift. Malinali proved invaluable as a translator, fluent in both Nahuatl and Mayan. Cortes already had slaves fluent in Spanish and Mayan, and Malinali gave Cortes the linguistic key necessary to build alliances with Nahuatl-speaking people, and allowed him to build a coalition against the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. While held by Cortes, Malinali was baptized as Doña Marina, and was described as his mistress. Obvious questions of consensual relationships between the two aside, Malinali gave birth to a son, a metaphoric first mestizo. Like our fairy tale traveling noble, Cortes intended to leave with his son, and Malinali, Maria, desperate not to lose her child to Cortes, chose to kill him instead. And she is now doomed to wander the rivers and lakes in search of her child. As mentioned earlier, this aspect of the story alludes to the horrendous long-term effects of human trafficking on a people. The association of La Llorona with roads and waterways, avenues through which people are stolen and sold into slavery, is painfully obvious. The stories of La Llorona are an amalgam of conquest and indigeneity, and convey a message of caution and fear for those who have shared the pain of cultural assault through conquest. Who should we be wary of? Who should we trust? How do we, as a community, find ways to adapt, heal, and grow through our cultural bonds? For my ancestors in particular, passing as Spanish became a favorable alternative to associating with the Indians. For better or worse, adopting Spanish names and converting to Catholicism may have meant a better life, but they could not whitewash their skin as it held strong to the red color of their land, Chitiltictlali, the red earth, though what we now call Colorado. They still lived in adobe houses, and were dependent on their environment and each other for survival. The Kingdom of New Mexico was the farthest northern frontier of the Spanish Empire, and later Mexico. They rarely had a priest and never had a doctor. The penitentes, a secret religious society, took care of most of the administrative duties for the community, while the curanderas addressed the physical and spiritual well-being of the people. As mentioned in the previous episode, curanderismo is a holistic system of Latin American folk medicine that blends religious beliefs, faith, and prayer with the use of herbs, massage, and other traditional methods of healing. These practices addressed the physical, spiritual, psychological, and social needs of the people who use it. Most families have a basic awareness of curanderismo elements, and often a matriarch has a deeper understanding and knowledge intended to be used for the care of their family. Additionally, there are specialists with advanced knowledge of things like herbal medicines, midwifery, protections against and or lifting curses, and coping with grief. Curanderismo blends elements of medieval Spain with local indigenous practices, analogous to the people who practice it, and it has become an empowering vehicle for decolonization. The Americas are not post-colonial, and generational trauma is not just something that happened in the past. Like the people who live the experience, colonization and generational trauma are perpetually evolving and adapting. Contemporary Chicanos have all been directly impacted and influenced by imperial colonialism in various ways. They've also found ways to adapt to it, and we are the inheritors of their legacy. Ancestors shared some of their knowledge with us, and we have dedicated a great deal of energy to connecting with other elders to help build upon their wisdom. It has been a long and arduous journey that has been rewarded by a connection to a kinship that thrives on experiential learning, relationships that are built on caretaking and becoming a good relative, respecting each other, all living and non-living things, what we see and what we do not see. Appreciation through action, being thankful as a moral and spiritual value, gratitude, reciprocity, harmony, and caretaking. While we cannot escape some of the suffocating, systematic problems omnipresent in our society today, there are ways that we can look to our own cultures and communities for help and healing.
right. So we wanted to come together just to reflect on everything that we've addressed in this episode. And I find it really interesting that I ended up taking a scientific route, this time really looking at what psychology has to say, and you were looking at a folk legend to understand the way that generational trauma has impacted indigenous people through colonization.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting how that worked out. Kind of pretty well balanced with the way we approached this topic today.
Yeah, and it's really important to consider the intersectionalities and the different approaches to understanding these issues. And something I really appreciated in your approach to the subject was the way that you made it kind of personal.
Yeah.
And you did talk about the way this impacted, people who would have been your ancestors. And you also mentioned the way that it kind of plays out in your family today, the reverberations of the historical trauma. And I find that to be really powerful when we're able to share those kinds of stories. And personally, it's something I don't talk a whole lot about, but I do have that kind of history in my own family. So actually, there was a man who was a German Jew, and he lived through the Holocaust, and it was extremely traumatizing for him. And then he eventually, after the war, ended up going to the United States and starting a family. But he was not able to process through the trauma in a good way. Yeah. Unfortunately, he had really internalized a lot of it, and it had caused him a lot of harm. And he in turn ended up, putting that harm onto his family and his children. And one of his children ended up growing up and being a man who was brought into my home. And so in turn, unfortunately, that man brought that harm into our home. And so quite honestly, you can see very clearly this link between the trauma of the Holocaust and how that brought that re-traumatization was continued through the generations.
A very clear, direct impact.
Yes. And so I think it's very sad. In a way, I have compassion for that man. What he did is not okay. What he did to his son and then what his son did to my family, it's not okay, of course. But something that I want people to get out of this episode is that these are opportunities. We always have an opportunity, as we've implied with the name of this episode, to heal backwards and move forwards. And that does not mean that we forget, right? That means that we need to understand this history. And that's why we've been so meticulous with this episode. And so in the spirit of understanding our history, I know you and I have both done a lot of genealogical research.
Yeah.
And which you've talked about. And on my end, in my family, there were members of my family that did not manage to immigrate to the United States. They didn't get out of Europe before the Holocaust, unfortunately, and many of them died. We do know a lot of them didn't make it. But there was one family that did survive. It was a family of 5, mother, father, and 3 children. And their entire story was documented in a book, which is amazing. So these are like some distant cousins, like I think third cousins maybe of mine. But I mean, they were living in the same region that my grandfather came from in southern Poland. And there's a family tree in the book, which I see relatives, I know how we're connected. So that's really amazing. The book is called The Scarlet Thread, The Amazing True Story of One Family's Steadfast Faith and Their Rescue from the Conflagration in Poland. And, it's a really powerful thing to have this book and to understand what my family went through there. But there's this other issue that we talked about, over-identification with the ghost of the victim, right?
Yeah.
Or the ghost of the perpetrator, depending on your situation, your history, or both, right? We don't want to forget that people might have elements of both in their heritage and their history. And the issue is that when that happens, it can become too overwhelming, right? If you over-identify with one or the other. And I have a story regarding that kind of situation coming from different backgrounds and also this book about my family.
Right.
have a very good friend who has German heritage,
Mm-hmm.
and for her it was very difficult, just knowing what had happened historically in Germany. And so we had talked about it. In a way, it brought us together. And that kind of makes me think of the story I told in my piece about the therapist and the client, and how they were both coming from those backgrounds, and they ended up seeing it as an opportunity. And for me, the kind of discussions I had with my friend uh, were very positive, and gave me a lot of hope for the future. And actually, this friend is the only other person I know who has read this book about my family cover to cover. And that is also a very impactful thing on me, that, she cared so much about that story.
Yeah.
So that's that kind of healing. But unfortunately, I think when we become over-identified with the ghost of the victim or the ghost of the perpetrator, it can overshadow it, and cloud our judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, one way that I think that this might happen, and this is a very touchy subject in the Jewish community, but I have my opinion about it, which is that I think that coming out of the Holocaust, being completely traumatized, and even for generations after that, the Jewish community is so overwhelmed with that experience of victimhood, and the horrors that they experienced. It has put them in a place of fear. And I think that sometimes that makes it difficult to be open to other perspectives, and it can impact certain things, for example, like the conflict in Israel and Palestine, which I don't think there are clear answers to, but I just feel, in my own experience and my research around this, my opinion is that the Jewish community is so traumatized that
Mm-hmm.
they have a hard time being open, because they're still very afraid.
Right.
And that fear is justified, but I also feel concerned about that difficulty in kind of being open to the other perspectives.
Right. Exactly. That's really important to take all of that into consideration, because it is a complex situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and another piece that sort of made me think about the different perspectives in history itself came out of my research that I did as a graduate student in Estonia. I actually was taking a research methods class that focused on oral history and memory studies.
Mm-hmm.
And in that course, we were really exploring how the past is understood and interpreted. And in this, we discussed how there's often the presence of a dominant ideology, right?
Right.
And so we're talking about here collective memory in society. And that dominant ideology isn't always necessarily accurate. There's a lot of different factors that come into play with that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it can be kind of superficial. So it takes a lot of work for us to really understand all these different perspectives that come together in creating what we understand as history. And some of the things we can look at is commemorative practices that
Mm-hmm.
communities might have. And so we have to think, what is being celebrated, right? And who is celebrating it? And then the other question we have to ask is, who is being silenced, and what voices are being excluded from that discussion? Because there's always going to be like kind of a prioritization of a certain narrative or a certain story. And in Estonia, I learned a lot about this because they have a pretty traumatic history.
Mm-hmm.
They've had a lot of war and occupation. They were occupied by the Germans very long time ago, and then they had Soviet occupation, and then again the Germans came in with the Nazi occupation.
Right.
And post-Soviet studies around generational trauma or collective memory focus on oral narratives. And they have really big digital archives, collections of individual stories from these periods. Um, and also like stories of the deportations, because
Yeah.
over 10,000 people were deported during this period.
Estonians
Yes, yeah,
by Soviet.
right,
Yeah.
right. One thing that we saw was a documentary film, but it really kind of pushed the genre of documentary films in a way. This film is called Life Stories. It's really difficult to find, honestly, outside of Estonia. It was made in 2007, and what's interesting, so what they did is they interviewed a bunch of people who survived from the Soviet era. And they had survived deportation and a lot of hardship. And they took those recordings of those interviews and then they recreated what the stories were being, what they were telling in a cartoon.
Right.
Because they weren't, obviously they weren't able to film these things as they happened. This was after the fact.
Yeah.
But it's all true. So it's an interesting kind of documentary, and also the fact that it was a cartoon made it easier to kind of process.
Digest.
Yeah, exactly. And I found it to be a very powerful film.
Yeah, I would love to see it sometime, and that really it brings up a lot of ideas, like when you think about memory and how memory can become almost dreamlike or cartoonish, I suppose. It's a really good way to present that. But it also reminds me of a lot of other things, kind of that we've been talking about, and the idea of, um, this colonization and the idea of post-colonial, right? The Americas are not post-colonial, nor is Japan or other parts of Europe. Um, this is an ongoing and evolving thing. We're still under some pretty heavily imposed systemic kinds of practices, and generational trauma is not only about what happened in the past, so it's about what we can do now and how history repeating itself, but giving um, giving us the opportunity to do the right thing when history is repeated. And so it's pretty relevant for what's going on right now with Black Lives Matter movement and all of that. And it reminds me of the situation with Emmett Till. If you're not familiar, was a 14-year-old who was murdered in August of 1955 while he was visiting relatives in Mississippi. He was accused of harassing or catcalling a white woman, and some relatives of hers abducted him and brutally murdered him. During his mother was so devastated, but she insisted on having an open casket so that people could see what happened to him
During the funeral.
during the funeral. Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. And that it was described by her as she couldn't describe it. Right? There was no way she could describe it. So this was the only way that she could think of to show the people what had happened and how bad this really was.
As a hate crime.
As a hate crime,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And his murderers were acquitted. It was an all-white male jury. Uh, Black folks and women were not allowed to serve on jury duty at the time. And his death really galvanized the civil rights movement nationwide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, interestingly, in 2007, this is 50 years after the murder, the woman who claimed that Till harassed her admitted that he hadn't grabbed her and that nothing that boy could do would ever justify what happened to him. So she recanted. On the 65th anniversary.
To the day.
To the day. That was September 23rd.
2020.
2020. Breonna Taylor's killers were acquitted. And for those of you who don't know, Breonna Taylor was the woman who was killed in her home, sleeping in her bed, innocent, cops came in and shot and killed her. And the police who were responsible for that were acquitted
on the
same day.
On the 65th anniversary that the killers of Emmett.
To the day. Yeah, so here we have an opportunity to do the right thing when history repeating itself, and we're just going down that same path once again. And also with La Llorona and, this narrative of children being taken, right?
Yeah.
This collective fear and ingrained fear of the children being taken by a specter. And right now, that specter is the U.S. Border Patrol
Yeah.
taking children away at the border from, refugees, migrant families who are just trying to get away and live a better life. And here they're stopped at the border. Families are being separated, put into concentration camps, and um, put into very, very traumatic situations, and thinking about that healing aspect and that different element of looking at La Llorona in a different way, reminiscing back to that Nahuatl story of the mother deity who's the protector, crying for the children, Siakuat, and then
that's the indigenous.
That's the indigenous
story.
Manifestation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until later, after colonization, that Malinali becomes the child killer, and the corruption through the brutality of colonization. It's really just a projection.
Yeah, and again, Malinali was a historical figure.
Exactly. Yeah, she was, and and then the evolution of the story and how it really embodies this sort of identity trauma, which is a kind of a mass cultural version of Stockholm syndrome, where the uh, where the a victim becomes identifies with the perpetrator and wants to be, in some cases, even wants to become like them.
Right. Yeah, and I kind of felt like going back to what you were saying about Malinali really quick, and how she became labeled as a baby killer.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about the history of colonization, that's very much like a projection, because the colonists were the ones who were stealing children.
Exactly.
And who were committing these crimes against the people. But yeah, they ultimately got the blame squarely laid on not only the people themselves, but the mothers.
Right. There's a lot of scapegoating going on.
Yeah. What a horrible twist.
Yeah.
But it leads into assimilation, right?
It leads into assimilation.
As a form of survival.
Exactly. Mm. Yeah. So you talk about that compassion piece too.
Yeah.
It is important to have a lot of compassion, because here we are. I used to resent a lot my family not teaching me or raising me into more of a more connected to the traditions. And like my grandparents made a conscious effort not to teach their kids Spanish, and of course I didn't learn Spanish, and that's another element too. It's like a layer of colonization. Spanish, never mind the indigenous language, but the fact that we actually have a lot of there's a certain kind of privilege that we're experiencing now that allows us to explore this in our heritage, and they did not feel that at all.
That's
that
true.
It was not safe for them to do, and they made that choice to protect us.
Right. And if I may, give my perspective from my own family as well, of course it's different. I come from a place of privilege as a white person with European heritage. But assimilation did impact my family in certain ways. For example, my grandparents spoke Yiddish, but when my grandfather moved here at the age of 6, he looked very Jewish in the sense that he had payas, the side locks. He wore the yarmulke on his head. So he could easily be identified as Jewish, and they had to cut his side locks and change everything because he was being attacked every day. He was being beaten very violently. So they had to assimilate, and then they did not want to teach Yiddish to their children. And I'm so bummed out because, of course, I try to sing Yiddish songs all the time, and I know I'm messing it up because I didn't grow up with it. And yeah, I feel that same frustration. But on the other hand, I know that from that period, because those family members managed to immigrate to the United States just before the Holocaust hit.
Yeah.
And there were family members who they made that journey all the way from Europe to the United States. And when they arrived, now I have to explain, they came from Jewish shtetls. And shtetls, it was a Jewish village. These don't exist anymore. It was a very insular community. they were destroyed in the Holocaust. But coming from those shtetls and arriving in New York was completely shocking to them. And when they saw that, they felt they couldn't be Jewish in the way they wanted to be. They couldn't carry on their traditions. And there's a story that some family members, when they were faced with that choice of assimilation, they got back on the boat, they went back to Europe, and then they ended up getting killed in the Holocaust. So this is something we may not think about, that the choice of assimilation, it can be a choice of life and death. And another aspect of it is that in my own family, and I'm speaking, in my generation right now, I have living family members who, when they were faced with anti-Semitism, they ended up internalizing that, right? So that comes with identification with the perpetrator. And this is an interesting thing, and you mentioned like Stockholm syndrome.
Exactly.
When they're faced with the choice of either dealing with this kind of pain or vulnerability, they'd rather find a way to feel strong and feel safe. So there was a rejection of Judaism and really an identification with anti-Semitism. And I think that that's very sad and unfortunate. I don't think that that's necessarily a path that's going to lead to healing, even if it might feel more comfortable.
Right.
But then again, I do want to have compassion for the kind of pressure that leads someone to make that choice.
So then, how do we heal?
It's a tricky situation, and I think that it just involves these kinds of conversations, this kind of awareness, and the dedication to just learning about this process, and
bringing awareness to suffering and oppression.
Yeah. And so I have a really interesting example of that came out of a class I was attending when I was studying in Japan, in Hokkaido. And the class was about indigenous education and how education systems can sometimes work in oppressive ways against indigenous people. And the professor had given a question to the class. He asked us to think about the kind of struggles that indigenous people, and he was specifically referring to Ainu people, the indigenous people of Japan, but he asked us to think about what kind of struggles they have dealt with. And he said, did we have any awareness of that coming from the backgrounds that we have? Like, is it something we had ever considered? And the class was small, but we were pretty diverse. Many of us were from different countries, and then there were 2 students who were Japanese. And we were going around the room having conversation, and when it came to a Japanese student, and he was clearly having a very strong reaction to this, and he said, but I'm from Hiroshima. My family and my community, we are so hurt already. We don't have room for anything else. We can't think of anything else. This has been too much. And that was, as an American, there were only 2 Americans in the room, myself and then the professor. So this was very poignant, to hear him say that. And I think that also harkens back to the kind of issue that I was hinting at with some Jewish people who are struggling with concepts related to the conflict with Israel and Palestine. When you become too overwhelmed with your own trauma and your own victimization, or the ghosts of victimization, like thinking about your ancestors, it can be paralyzing, and very understandably so, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think we need to consider that. I want to have compassion for where other people are coming from, but it takes a lot of work to get through this. And that brings us to our piece to ponder for this episode. So every episode we have a piece to ponder, which is going to be just something interesting that's related to our subject for the episode. And this piece to ponder is a video that we came across on YouTube that was made by Science Magazine. And this film was about the survivors of Hiroshima. And it's particularly poignant right now because August 6th on 2020, it was 75 years since the US has dropped the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. And up to 120,000 people died in the aftermath. And so the people who had survived the bombing have become known in Japan as hibakusha. And that literally just means survivor of the atomic bombs. And there's just a really interesting story that they explain in this film, and that is that after the bomb was dropped and after in the aftermath of the war, the United States went into Hiroshima and they created what is called the Radiation Effects Research Foundation's Lifespan Study. What this study did was that it sought to understand the effects of atomic radiation on the human body. Something that is, it's baffling to me to think that the people who just did this, who just killed thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, they then go in and want to do research on the people that survived this attack. That is remarkable to me. So the people who they ended up studying, these survivors, were not offered any compensation and not even medical treatment. These are the hibakusha, the survivors. And the reason for this was that that would have implied that the US had done something wrong. That's pretty remarkable. But people did participate in the study. People volunteered. And now, today, the basis for radiation safety standards that are used around the world, and this is from power plants to hospitals, all come from this research study.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it comes from that research study.
Like how much radiation minimum dosage is
Yeah.
safe, and how far away you can be from it.
Right, cancer treatment, x-rays, like all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And to me that's just remarkable. And they actually interview one of these survivors, the hibakusha, and he says why he did it. He says, like, he felt this was important for the betterment of humanity. This was how we were going to heal and find peace. And so this is a really powerful little film.
Yeah.
I recommend you check it out. We'll put links to it up on our website and social media. I do want to give a content warning. There are some clips, some scenes of the people who are injured, and that can be a bit intense, but otherwise it is a very good film. Yeah, and so that is our piece to ponder for the week. We have one more special thing we want to share.
Right, another way you can get involved and help.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a different subject, but we just launched a fundraiser for a couple who are very close friends of ours. They come from countries where being LGBT is considered a crime. And because of this, they were put into a situation where they were forced to flee to go live in Europe, where there's more acceptance, it would be safer for them. Now, I have to say that because of the delicate situation surrounding LGBT people in their home countries, we have to kind of protect their identities. They have to remain anonymous. But I do want to say, so they were married in a country that recognizes same-sex marriage. But when they returned to where they've been living in Europe, they found that this marriage was not honored or recognized. And so this is creating a big problem in them being able to stay there and live safely together. This is where they have jobs and everything. They've built lives. They've been there for years. And they're now at risk of, losing everything. And so there is a court case that they've started. It's the first case of this nature. And so they don't have enough money to move forward with the case. So there's the fundraiser is to help them pay for this. And this is a really important case because, as I said, since it's the first case, this could set a precedent for future LGBT couples in this country. So if anybody wants to donate, I will also put a link to that. I'll have that out. Please consider. And even if you can't donate, I mean, every little bit helps, of course. But if you can just share the link, then and get the word out about this fundraiser, that will certainly help.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every little bit helps.
Yeah, definitely. And be sure to check out our website and follow us on social media. You can find us, just look for Adventure Scholar, but we'll have the links available as well. And thank you so much for listening, and continue on your adventure.